Hello and welcome again to another episode of One Starfish, where our mission is to change the world one starfish or one person at a time. As always, make sure to rate, review, subscribe, all the stuff. I'm really excited for our guest today. Bradley Roth was in Arizona. Now he's traveling a little bit. I'm actually going to get into that because I think that's pretty cool. He started Not Most People podcast and founder of a company in 2021. Before that, he's been in online marketing and the fitness industry, personal development industry for quite a while. Beautiful wife. She's a nurse. Incredible couple. So excited to have you. Thanks so much and welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Angela. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So let's get into, where you started. Not Most People. I know some of your goals for it. I just think it's really cool. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now and what you're doing it for and where you see the future going with it.
Yeah. So with Not Most People, it was something that I never ever thought I would be doing. I grew up with a huge fear of public speaking. If I had to talk in front of the class, even if it was like 5 people, I didn't sleep for weeks leading up to it. And my voice was shaky. And I don't know why. I could play sports in front of, thousands of people and love it and enjoy the spotlight. But when it came to communicating and speaking in front of anyone, it was like, no way. Like I terrified. So anyways, I got into Arate a few years ago. I had this concept of Not Most People that was in my head for a while. I was always someone who asked questions, challenged the status quo, and realized that most people aren't very happy, healthy, or wealthy. So why would I want to be like most people? That was kind of the logical thought process behind it. But again, I had it stuck in my head for several years because I was like, I'm too afraid to start a YouTube. Podcasts are just for the Andy Frisellas and the mega celebrities of the world. That's not me. But then I ended up getting into Arate, which is where we met in 2020, like right in the middle of the pandemic. And I saw, wow, all these people in here have podcasts and they're, quote unquote, normal people. So that kind of got me thinking. And then as I started networking and making connections, I got invited onto a couple. The first one was a marketing podcast. It was only like 20 minutes and that's what I was doing at the time, but I wasn't necessarily passionate about it. And so I got invited onto that. It was just a Zoom interview and I was like so nervous and I bombed it. I feel like, and I was like, oh no, I don't know about this podcast thing. And then I got invited onto one more. And this one happened to be more about kind of a little bit of like what we're talking about today, the journey and things learned and mindset and all that. And an hour plus later, we're still like going, having a great time. And almost kind of like the time just flew by, kind of hit that flow state in a way. And I remember closing the laptop. That was November of 2020. And I said, okay, Not Most People is going to be a podcast. Like that was kind of the moment. And I said, I'm going to have this thing up in like a month. And it took me, like 4, because there's, as you know, a lot that goes into podcasting, that behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. So I started the podcast in March of 2021. And I was originally just didn't really have plans to monetize it or anything. I was like, this is just a passion project, something I want to do. I'll do it for a couple hours on the side and I'll continue to do what I've been doing with marketing. And I found very quickly, I started getting all kinds of positive feedback with the podcast. Again, the concept had been in my head for several years. So I was kind of clear off the bat, taking my background in marketing, translated well into the podcasting world. And so I started getting a lot more positive feedback in the first like 2 weeks with the podcast than I had in the last like 2 years with the marketing business. So I was like, found myself gravitating more and more towards that because that gave me energy. And I was kind of like one foot out the door with what I was doing marketing wise. So several months in, I decided to like kind of jump all in on it. I didn't know how I was going to do it or how I was going to really, support myself with it. But the first thing I did was I created a podcasting course for, to help other people start podcasts. I love teaching and kind of sharing my experience. And so I started with that. And then that kind of went into like a mini coaching group with the podcasting. And then I started thinking bigger with the podcast, the brand, Not Most People, like kind of creating this bigger vision. And earlier this year, I started my own community within it called the Not Most People Alliance, which is, I call it like an Arate mini almost, but not so much of a coaching group, more of like the community side of it, just connecting like-minded people. And then I started getting into live events this past year as well. I did a couple live events out in Arizona, like a live podcast and networking and that kind of thing. And so that's something else that just kind of happened. I never really ever planned on like being on a stage, or like that was my first time ever speaking on a stage or anything like that. So it's been a really cool kind of growth process. And now I have a lot of other things that are kind of in the works right now, building out that brand and that vision. And right now I have like a very clear kind of 5 to 10 year roadmap with all of it. So hopefully that answers your question. It's
does.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So if you have someone that says to you, like, you know, throughout all this, like it's pretty major, you know, kind of quitting a job and
Mhm.
starting your online, you know, like podcasting and stuff like that. Did you have support all the time, or how was that for you?
It was tough. It's still tough. Even when I worked, if I rewind a little bit and go back to when I started in the fitness industry, that's what I went to school for. I got out, I landed my dream. Well, I don't know if my dream job necessarily, but I ended up working at this gym close by to me. That was awesome. It didn't feel like a job, but it was very part time. So it didn't really quite, I barely kind of squeaked by during that. And so that's how I started looking around for these other things. And that's kind of how I got into entrepreneurship, because I was like, I need another flexible way to make money. That was my original like motivation for that. And so I kind of stumbled into marketing and did that for a while. Again, with that, we moved to Arizona in 2019, and I had just started my marketing stuff, and I had like one or two clients. And so I built up, I logged a lot of credit card debt to kind of make up for it, to sustain myself. And I had no experience, no savings, no source of income, no one to like kind of like, hey, I'm starting this, can you lend me money kind of thing. So I made a lot of mistakes for sure. It was definitely stressful at times, and I'm still kind of working myself out of that. But I tend to have, I guess, a unusually high risk tolerance compared to the average person. But I also told myself that now's the time. I was in my 20s. I said, if I'm going to like take a big risk like that and take a leap, now's the time before we have a mortgage and kids and all that kind of stuff. So you have to take into context kind of all the different factors. But uh, I just always tried to think long term. And I said, there's lots of things I could do that would help me in the short term. But then am I going to turn around, 1, 3, 5, 10 years from now and be like, oh man, I kind of wish I had done it and followed what I really wanted. And at that point, it's harder to change course, I feel like. If you get used to a certain paycheck and lifestyle, or at least I know for me, that was how my mind operated. So I just kind of I just kind of weighed the pros and cons, long term, short term. And so yeah, I wouldn't recommend it for everyone. Like if I could do it again, I probably would have, because I was young. I didn't have like a mentor, so I'd read all these things. Oh, you got to go all in, and quit, ditch this, and go all in your business. And then
Burn your
I
boats.
did that. Yeah, exactly. I burned my boats before I even like had boats. So uh, so I wouldn't recommend doing it exactly that way, but that's, obviously I'll have I try to
You
look
weren't
at it
even
as
on
like, I'll
shore yet. We're burning the boats. You got to swim.
exactly. Yeah. And I'm like, oh man, what am I doing? But, somehow I've managed to make it to here. And at least here, like with the marketing, it never really felt in full alignment. There were moments where I was like, oh, this is cool. But then with not most people, I'm like, this is kind of it. This is the long term. I really believe in it and that sort of thing. So it feels good. It takes a lot of trial and error to get there, but once you find that thing, at least you can have some peace of mind knowing that like, okay, I'm on the right path.
So I feel like you have a lot of self-belief. Where do you think that came from, and how do you think people can develop that?
It's funny you say that, because in my mind, I don't know if I necessarily believe that. I think I'm pretty stubborn. I'm more stubborn than most people. Like I won't quit something, even if like the marketing stuff, I probably should have quit far before I
Some
did.
belief in knowing that if you're stubborn enough, you'll win. Because if you didn't think you'd win, you would quit.
Yeah, I always have. It's interesting. and I tell my wife this, like I've always had a lot of short-term doubt, but long-term belief, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Like I always wonder, like, you know, how am I going to figure out next week or next month or the next couple months? But when I look out like on a longer picture, a year or 5 years or whatever, I'm like, I know I'm on the right track and things are going to work out. So that really has kind of allowed me to hold on in the short term a lot of times when there's a lot of doubt. Uh, so I think it's really important to have that long term picture, that compelling future to kind of keep you in the game, because I think a lot of people don't take the time to sit down and develop that. And
Mhm.
then when things get tough, they don't have that to turn to. And then it's really easy to kind of give up on whatever it is they're doing.
Mm-hmm. I think so. So if
Yeah.
you're listening to this, and I think self doubt and lack of belief is a big killer of a lot of dreams.
Hmm.
And so that's why I wanted to touch on that because I was like, you have it.
Yeah.
So there's a number one tip, like don't focus on where you're at, which I've talked about before. Don't focus on where you're at. Focus on where you're going, and
Hmm.
and you'll get there quicker than if you focus on where you're at. If you focus on where you're at, you probably won't get there. So
Yeah.
that's a really good tip. I love that. And have you always been like entrepreneurial? I mean, you went into personal training, you went into this. Were your parents entrepreneurial? Where did that come from, do you think?
That's a good question. My parents were not the least bit entrepreneurial. They
Okay.
both came from huge families. My dad was one of nine, my mom was one of 17. So for them to like, they both put themselves through college and, got degrees and careers. And so like that was for them success. And that's what they, you know, tried to share with me and promote with me. So growing up, it's crazy. Like a lot of people I talk to are like, "Oh yeah, I was doing odd jobs and the lemonade stand, and I was like a natural born entrepreneur." And like I was probably the furthest thing from that. Like this is gonna sound crazy, but I remember be like I don't know. I just homeschooled. I was semi sheltered, and my parents, they taught me like morals and follow the rules and get good grades, but not necessarily a lot about money and finance or the real world necessarily. So I remember like junior or senior year of college, my my roommate talked about like his dad's bar. And I remember I was like, "What do you mean like your dad's bar?" And I'm like, "My dad's bar." And I'm like, "He owns it?" He's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, I at that time, like 21, I didn't know that people own businesses. I thought they were just these like entities that existed on their own.
Right.
Like that's
Kind of like
how
where do
like
eggs come from? I don't know, the grocery
yeah,
store.
that's I didn't know like I remember growing up, I didn't know what a mortgage was. I didn't know like a property tax. I was a realtor because I got my realtor's license when I was working at the gym as like, a way to try and, do something else.
Hmm.
And I remember like I was doing open houses and people would come and ask about like, whoa, well, what are the taxes on this house? And I remember like, I was like, I'll get back to you. Cause in my head, I'm like, what is that? Like I had my realtor's license and I didn't know what property tax was. I didn't know that like there was just like these really basic things I should have learned in probably like third grade that like I didn't know existed. So for me, like again, I didn't even know what entrepreneurs were until after college. So that story is kind of like you listen and you're like, what? Like, how did, because the average like 10-year-old probably knows those things. But um, yeah, I remember like mortgages. I was always thinking like growing up, I'm like, man, how do people like save up enough money to like buy these houses like cash or whatever, because I thought that was the only way. So
Good
I
way.
had like yeah, I had a very late start. Like I was working at the gym and then, I met my now wife, and she like her dad owned a business growing up and she grew up around a lot of entrepreneurs. So she kind of like exposed me to this new world of people that were, not all middle class, you know, uh, kind of career oriented people. And so that kind of got me thinking. And then also looking for other things. I always knew I couldn't work a desk job. So I guess in that way, I was kind of like, and I always kind of was like silently rebellious against authority and that kind of stuff. So I always had like some of those personality traits of, typical entrepreneurs. But in terms of like, did I grow up being like, I want to own my own business? Like, I didn't know it existed. So no, I definitely didn't. But yeah, so
So when
I
you
feel like I
started
got,
your own business,
yeah.
Bradley, did you
Hmm.
get a lot of did you encounter a lot of resistance from family?
Uh, my family's like, they're supportive, but they also, show concern because that's like my dad. we're very different. Like I'm the oldest of four, he is the youngest of nine. So like, kind of how uh birth order dynamics play into it. Like he's very, very risk averse. And I'm like, very kind of independent. I'm a risk taker. So we tend to look very differently at those types of things. Like he supports it. I think part of him, he said he wishes he like kind of looked more into starting a business at some point. But um, so they always like supported me. But then like I would hear from friends who like my parents asked my friends to like ask more about my business and like, and my wife and stuff was like, yeah, your mom like and dad were telling me this and that. They wanted me to ask you about like people were like they were definitely still skeptical, but like not to my face as much, if that
That's
makes sense.
hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man, that's awesome. I love it. And so what were some ways that you overcame, some of that? Like you said, a lot of people are like, well, I have people in my life and, they don't necessarily support. How important do you feel support is from your family and friends in being successful? And
Hmm.
what are some ways to work through it if they're not supportive? Like people are like, well, do I cut them out of my life? I don't want to cut people out. How important do you feel associations are?
It's I mean, associations are very important. The thing with family that's kind of tricky is that like you don't choose your family, whereas your other associations you tend to have more choice over. So like your parents, you still got to love them in most cases, and they'll still love you. So it's kind of like, what topics do you talk about with them and that sort of thing. Now it's at the point where that they've just accepted that like I'm always gonna do my own
I
thing
don't
and
know what
that
he's
kind of
doing,
stuff.
but he's doing his
Yeah,
thing.
like at a certain point they kind of like give in or they see a little bit of your success and they're like, okay, like for me, I think they didn't understand at all what I was doing with the marketing, which I think almost I didn't either. I felt like at the time, but once I started the podcast, it gave them something like tangible that they could like, they started listening and they were like, oh, this is pretty good. And like, so now they're like, they could relate to it. So that was like kind of a big turning point there. But in terms of like choosing your associations, I remember I was trying to, again, I was working at the gym part time still. And like, I'd been at the gym for years. I had tons and tons of friends and connections. It was my hometown. And I remember as soon as I started kind of branching out and trying to do these other things, whether it was being a realtor or like when I started my marketing stuff, the amount of people that started like just talking behind my back and like
Mm,
who I considered to be my friends and stuff was like really shocking. And like even to my wife, who was, my girlfriend at the time, they're like, what are you doing with him? And he doesn't know, like, and it was just like, and she, of course, she would tell me all of it because she's
your
like
girlfriend.
people, it's amazing. People think that like she doesn't talk to me, but I don't know. But anyway, so that happened. And so that environment kind of became a negative place for me.
Mhm.
And we had we met in like 2015, 2017. We did a lot of traveling together and like really got bit by the travel bug hard. So we decided like she was a nurse. We're like, let's do the travel nurse thing and maybe go live somewhere else. And I'm starting an online business. And so that was kind of like the vision. And from there, it was just like, yeah, 2018, we're like, let's do it. And we moved across the country. We spent 3 months in South Carolina as the first place. And then we drove across the country out to Phoenix. I'd never been out there. And we moved out there and, almost kind of hit the restart button on a lot of things, right? Like didn't know a single person out there, but kind of got away from that toxic environment that I was in and was able to kind of almost rebuild all of my associations. And so I think it's really important, especially I see it all the time, people who are young in their 20s and like want to do big things, but they're, you know, still hanging out with their high school friends who just don't get it and their family and stuff. Like it could be really, really hard to, like, it could still be done, but you're just adding resistance. So if you can find a way to move or to, distance yourself and find these new associations, like it's a life changer. Has been for us.
Yeah, so make sure your associations are good. What are some
Yep.
other tips that you would say that have helped you keep the mindset on the days, like you said, it's not obviously easy always. So
Hmm.
on the days that things are struggling and you're like beyond looking in the future and keeping that vision of the future, which I think is very important also. What are some other things that you've found that have really helped fortify you to continue to move forward on the days you didn't feel like it?
Well, I know everyone hates this answer, but I think it's a very individual thing for people. And I think not enough people spend the time on personal development, on introspection, on learning themselves, what makes them tick, and how they operate best. Like for me, man, I've tried. There's all this like 4 a.m., 5 a.m. club. Like if you're, you know, if you sleep more than like 4 hours, you're not hustling or whatever. And and I found out like for me, like I'm much better off staying up late, getting up late. Like I just operate way better that way. And so like it's figuring out optimizing for you, figuring out what it is for you. And then also like for me, if I'm starting to feel burnout, like now I'm finally tuned, I'm more aware of it and I can kind of, you know, correct it or do something that's going to recharge me faster. Whereas before I would just go until I like fizzled out and, crash and burned. And so it's like, it's learning a lot of those things, what works for you, who you are, what your goals are, if what you're doing right now really aligns to that. And then, and also like we just kind of talked about building that support system. Now I have that support system. Like I'm feeling down or whatever, like I'll just go in the RTA group and look at what people are doing. And I'm like, all right, like, or maybe I'll reach out to you or someone else that I know in the group. And now I have that circle that I can like turn and we've all been through it. We all share kind of the similar struggles and that sort of thing. So, again, building those associations, learning about yourself, creating that self-awareness, because that's going to give you the answers on what you need to do to stay in the game, because everyone's motivated by different things and everyone, struggles with different things. So that is kind of my, I guess, not super specific answer, but figure it out for yourself and take the time to do that. I think one of the most valuable things I did do, burning the boats and, working just for myself, was I had all of this time for myself to spend with myself, to read, to do like the internal thinking without outside noise that I think a lot of people lack or a lot of times even avoid.
That's good. Is there a book that you think that's really helped you? You mentioned reading, and I love reading. So, was there a book or an audio or something that you listened to
Mm.
or read that you feel made a big impact in where you're at and how you think and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I would say one book that I always recommended as like required reading for anyone is Awaken the Giant Within by Tony Robbins. Like for me, when I first read that book, like the amount of light bulbs and the amount of kind of mental like aha moments I had with that and just understanding basic psychology, because I think basic psychology and understanding how you think, how other people think is like the most important education you can give yourself. And especially as an entrepreneur, where like all these soft skills and marketing and relationships and all that kind of stuff matters a lot. Like that book, it's a big book. Tony Robbins, I know, is kind of the stereotype stage rah rah, but his book is very different than his events. And it was written in like 1991 or something like that. So, but that one was huge for me. And then so I would say kind of like personal development, psychology side, that one. And then uh, entrepreneur wise, anything by MJ DeMarco. So he's kind of not a huge public personality, but his books are absolutely incredible and give kind of like a no BS look at entrepreneurship. And those books were really turning points for me. He has three. He's the only book that I've read, or he's the only author where I've read every single book that he comes out with.
The 3 books.
Yep. Millionaire Fastlane is the first one. That was kind of the first one for me. And then Unscripted, which was a big inspiration for not most people. And then The Great Rat Race Escape was his last one. So I won't get into the details of them, but definitely go check them out.
Okay, those sound good. I have not read them, so I'll have to check them out. So appreciate that. That's awesome. I love good books to read.
Mm-hmm.
It's so good. I know people have got a lot of value from this. In wrapping up, I always ask 3 final questions and then anything that we didn't touch on that we just want to leave with our listeners. So first final question is, if someone's looking for their purpose, what's one sentence that you would say to help them find it?
Try a lot of things, pursue your interests, and eventually you'll get there.
I love it. Now, I'm sure you have more than one, but what comes to mind? What's a favorite quote and why?
I would say, I think it's Mark Twain, but it's every time you find yourself on this side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect. And that's a big part of not most people. It's anti-groupthink. It's, because a lot of times, again, the majority of people are not probably where you want to be.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good one. And what's one word or sentence you want on your gravestone?
Oof. That's a good one. I mean, I feel like if things go where I want them to go,
not most people.
that's where I was going. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
right now, awesome. I'll go with that one.
Yeah, I love it. That's cool. And so if you run into someone in a coffee shop and they're like, man, listen to the podcast, it got so much, how to run a business and mindset and stuff like that. But what's one thing that maybe we didn't touch on that you just think is really important for our listeners to hear?
I think not most people, when I started it, there was two sides to it. There was, like, if you took a Venn diagram, almost one side is kind of being excellent. That's the first one I think comes to mind. The second side is kind of almost like anti the matrix, thinking for yourself, breaking out of these societal patterns. So for me, like the advice that I always give to people and that I wish more people did was just question everything, not in like a skeptical way, but in like a healthy, logical way. Everything that's told to you by everyone, run it through a filter. Does this make sense? Why are they saying this? What's the reason behind it? So just question everything. And I think that's something that a lot of people have lost.
That's good. I like that. As always, guys, make sure to rate, review, subscribe. We'll have all of Bradley's information in the show notes, his podcast, his links, all the stuff. So make sure to check it out. I know it's a great podcast, so make sure to check it out too. As you're obviously into listening to podcasts, or you wouldn't be on this one. And, go out there and share. And together, if we, help one starfish or one person at a time, together, we can change the world. Thanks for being on, Bradley.
Thank you.